Matthew 19, there's a lot of information in this passage, but what I'm going to be preaching on today is not a politically correct sermon. It's not a sermon that a lot of people are going to like, but it's actually about marriage and divorce in the Bible. And this is a very timely sermon because this is something that we all have to, that all America is dealing with and has problems with, because I was looking up statistics. And again, these statistics aren't, I'm not saying this is scripture here as far as statistics, but they say about 40 to 50% of all marriages end in divorce. So if it's 50%, that means out of two people, out of two marriages, one's going to fail in divorce. And I was trying to look up, like in Christian realms, but that's so vague because they link Catholics and Protestants, everybody in that. So, and even in that, they don't really know. So I'm just going to assume it's 50% across the board, whoever you are. Because I would say most of America in general, a lot of them, the majority of people claim to be Christian. Okay, that don't listen to the media to say, oh, it's everybody's atheist now. It's not the case. Not unless you go into these big cities and may have a little more of a percentage of these atheists and agnostics. But when we knock these doors around here, most everybody claims to be Christian. And that's the case in most of America. So all that to say is that this is a big issue. But I first want to talk about what marriage is. Because right now there's confusion on this as far as what marriage is in general. And then I want to get into the divorce aspect, and more so the remarried aspect is what the Bible gets into on this. So I'm going to talk about that. Next week I want to preach a sermon on how to have a good marriage. So this is more just like what's the nuts and bolts when it comes to marriage and divorce and all this stuff. This is a very timely message, and it's something that needs to be preached. And you need to look at this. I'm not against anybody in this room, because I know people have been divorced. I know people have been remarried. I know all these different things that are in the room. I'm not preaching against anybody here. This is all just what the Bible says about this subject. And if anything that you need to take away from this, you need to say, what do the children need to hear? Okay, if you made this mistake, if you've done this in the past, I'm not against you. But this is what the Bible teaches on this. So first, what is marriage? Okay? So Matthew 19, go there in the very beginning there. Jesus is laying out what marriage is in general. And then they asked him a question. They're tempting him. Okay? Now, what people are going to claim to be, they're going to say that I'm a Pharisee for what I preached today. But isn't it interesting that what were the Pharisees actually saying? They were saying that you should get a divorce for any cause. Right. The Pharisees, so you call me a Pharisee, define irony, because they are completely opposite of what they're saying when they say you're a Pharisee. If you're saying, hey, there's only one cause for divorce, and that's what Jesus says here, we'll get into that. But I first want to get into what the Bible teaches about marriage. So he first starts off with that. They're saying, can you divorce your wife for any cause? And he says, well, he backs it up and says, well, here's what marriage is in general right here. And in verse 4 there, it says, and he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore, they are no more twain but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Now he's going way back, because he's going back to Genesis 1 and 2 with Adam and Eve. So he's showing that from the very beginning, marriage was instituted. With Adam and Eve, that was the first marriage. That's how it was instituted. But if you don't have to necessarily turn there, but Genesis 1:27, it says, so God created man in his own image, and in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And this isn't a sermon against gay marriage, because I could care less if they get married, because that's not what the Bible teaches about the queers. It talks about them being put to death. So you can marry them and then stone them right after that. That's fine with me. But what I'm saying here is that marriage obviously is between a man and a woman. Okay, unless you're an idiot or you're a pervert, you know that that's the case, right? But what he's saying with this is that at the very beginning, it was two that became one flesh. There's a lot in this. First of all, the fact that you should only have one wife, and one husband. You shouldn't have this. We don't believe in polygamy. Although people in the Bible did have multiple wives, that doesn't mean that it was right. And so at the very beginning, they too should be one flesh. That's the institution of marriage. And it says, don't let man put asunder what God had joined together. So from the very beginning, it was that way. In Genesis 2:24, it says, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, and the man and his wife were not ashamed. Okay, so we know that marriage is honorable and all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. So that means that, that God has blessed that, and for man and woman to be together in that relationship and one flesh to come together, that is godly. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing perverted about it. That's what God has instituted. And so, but today, there's a lot of weird stuff out there as far as, I don't know if you've heard this, that you don't need, the government needs to stay out of marriage, and basically it's wrong to have a marriage license, and you don't need a marriage license, you don't need the state to be involved in your marriage. Well, that's not what the Bible teaches. Go to Romans chapter 7. So I kind of want to just lay this down, because there's some weird doctrines out there of the fact that you can just basically if a man and a woman come together and they commit the act that married people do, that they're automatically married. No. And so what we'll see is that there's actually multiple elements to marriage. It's not just the vow, and it's not just the consummation. It's everything together, okay? And so, but in Romans chapter 7, I've had people say this, well, you don't need a law, you don't need it to be law binding, right? And so, Romans 7, verse 1, it says, know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth, but if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So there's a couple things in this. First of all, it's still death, but it's bound by the law. And notice, some people have this weird idea too, that if your spouse died, you couldn't get remarried. No, it's still death. Okay? And someone asked that weird question, the question they asked Jesus, they said, what about this woman that she married a guy, he died, and then she married his brother, and then he died. She married all 7 brothers, right, through the course of time. And he said, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be, And he's saying, you do greatly err not knowing the scriptures, because in heaven, you're not given a marriage, you're not married. So, as much as I love my wife, when we die, and let's say we're here for the tribulation and the rapture happens, we're not going to be married anymore. Okay? And so that's just the fact of marriage. Some of you are really happy about that. Some of you are sad about that. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, but it's law binding. And it's not just going into to your mother's tent, so to speak. Now, I'll show you a verse on this, and this is where people go and say, well, see, there was no ceremony and there's no law binding action here. Go to Genesis chapter 24, and this is where I'm going to pull this from. So, I just want you to know that I will never do a marriage. I'll never do a wedding where there's no license from the state or the government. I won't do it. Because first of all, if they say that, listen, ladies, if a guy wants to marry you and they say, you know what, I don't want it to be law binding, you should run away from that relationship, okay? Because what does that tell you? That tells you that they're not serious about that commitment. And so that's something that, it just in itself, even let's say the Bible didn't say it needed to be law binding, that in itself should be what? Why would you care if it's law binding if you're going to be with me till death? But in Genesis 24, this is the story of Isaac and Rebekah. And in verse 67, so Genesis 24 and verse 67, it says, and Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Now, Sarah had already died. And so basically this is describing the consummation and the fact that that's when they were officially, that's everything's complete. They were married at that point. But see, they say, well, you just have to consummate, and that's what makes you married. Well, Romans 7 clearly throws that out. But you may ask, well, why does it need to be law-binding? Because adultery was punishable by death in the Bible. So go to Leviticus chapter 20. Now, if it's not law-binding, how in the world are you going to give capital punishment on something that's not on the books? Right? So Romans chapter 7 clearly states that it is binding by the law. But now, obviously, in the United States and in most countries, this isn't, there's not capital punishment for adultery. But in the Bible, that's what it was. And so, therefore, it needed to be bound by the law. And so, in Leviticus 20 and verse 10, it says, "And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." That's Bible. That seems harsh, right? But that's Bible. I believe it. I believe everything in the Bible. Anybody ever comes up to me and tries to give me some passage about dealing with servants and slavery, the Bible doesn't say slavery, but if you were to say, well, they sold this person and they did this, if God says to do it, it's right. Period. I don't care if that's not socially acceptable. This is not wicked. And there's preachers today, Baptist preachers today, that will look at a society that stones adulterers and stones homosexuals or queers, and they'll say it's inhumane and wicked. And it's just like, have you not read the Bible? Are you telling me that God is inhumane in Leviticus 20? Are you saying that he's wicked in Leviticus 20? And at the very least, they'll say, well, we're not only Old Testament. Well, was it right at least back then? You'd have to say, well, it was right back then, now it's wicked, which wouldn't make any sense. Because we're talking about morality. We're not talking about customs of the law and what you wear and what you eat. So, but you may think of the woman, that was caught in adultery. And this isn't in my notes, but John chapter 8 is where you'll find that story. And they'll say, well, see, in the New Testament, Jesus is against the capital punishment. No, he's not. He said that if a child curseth father or mother, let him die to death. That's out of the mouth of Jesus Christ, okay? And that's one that the atheists and the libtards and the fagnostics and all them, they mock those verses, but Jesus actually quoted it, okay? And so they'll say, well, in Leviticus it says this. Yes, it does, and amen to it. And so, but Deuteronomy, there's a couple things. When Deuteronomy 17, I want to kind of just talk about that capital punishment just for a second. Because it's not like they would just kill people willy-nilly. I mean, it had to be according to the law, and it had to be under 2 or 3 witnesses. So notice, though, in Leviticus 20, so you're going to Deuteronomy 17, Leviticus 20 and verse 10, it says, "The adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death." Now, in that story, when they brought her, was the adulterer there with them? Well, there's one portion that they didn't get right. They need to be both put to death together. And it needs to be under 2 or 3 witnesses. Not only that, but it wasn't the law of the land. And even the Pharisees, when they were wanting to put Jesus to death, they said, according to law, he must be put to death, but it's not lawful for us to put him to death. So that's why they were tempting him with that, because they wanted to see if he'd go against the government. And so that shows me, today in our lives, our government doesn't put queers to death, doesn't put adulterers to death. That means that we need to go with that. Even though that's not what the perfect law of liberty says, we need to go with the law of the land and just, try to live peaceably with all men. Now, them not going by that is going to be the downfall of our country. But, that's just the way it was in Jesus' day. They didn't put to death adultery. Or if they did, it had to be by their hands. It couldn't be by the Jews or by Israel itself. But in Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, this covers just capital punishment in general. But notice what it says in verse 6. It says, "At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. The hands of the witness shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterward the hands also of all the people. So thou shalt put the evil away from among the people. So we see that it has to be at least 2 witnesses. And that's why when they were going against Jesus in the judgment, they were saying, they were trying to find 2 witnesses that agreed to each other. But do you know it also says that if you witness against somebody and you lie, that you are to get the punishment that you were pronouncing against them. You know those false witnesses that came against Christ should all have been put to death. The hypocrisy and the wickedness that was going on in Jesus' trial is amazing. When you look at the law and how that should have went out. They said they didn't agree to each other. All those people should have been put to death because that's what they were trying to do to Jesus. And so, anyway, with that, that's why it needs to be law binding. That's why the Bible teaches that, is because if it's an ordinance to where it would be capital punishment to commit adultery, then it needs to be law binding. And so, anyway, all that to say is that I will not perform a wedding unless there's a marriage certificate, okay? Because I'm not going to be a part of some shack up, and that's what that would be, is some shacking up, and then basically they can just get out of it whenever they want with no problems. So it should actually be hard to get out of it. So here's the touchy subject, is divorce. Okay? So we all kind of understand what marriage is that you get married, you stay married until death, right? Most people, I think, understand it. Most people wouldn't disagree with that as far as just that logic and that understanding in the Bible. Here's where it comes in, and this is where the Pharisees say, can we get a divorce for any cause? And I'll show you why they were tempting him, because of what the law actually says in Deuteronomy about the bill of divorcement, and why they're trying to sneak this in there. And so, but first go to Malachi chapter 2. So I want you to see, first of all, what does God think about divorce in general? I'm going to show you all the places that divorce is mentioned in the New Testament as far as what Jesus said. We already covered Romans chapter 7, and I'm going to mention all that. Then I'm going to mention the exception and talk about what that's talking about. But first I want you to see Malachi chapter 2 and verse 16. Malachi chapter 2 verse 16, it says, "For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away. For one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that ye deal not treacherously." So it says here, now putting away, what we see, and especially when you look at all the scripture in the New Testament, putting away and divorce are the same thing. If you put away your wife, you're divorcing your wife. And we'll actually see a verse where the wife puts away her husband. So even back then, ladies, that the women they were divorcing their husbands and all this stuff. So it was going both ways. And so, but why is this so timely? Because I know people that have gotten divorces, and particularly with children. This is where I get enraged when it comes to divorce. Is because I know people that have children in the broken homes, and the children that suffer for this, and the excuses that people have to get a divorce. Well, I don't have the butterflies anymore. I'm just not feeling loved anymore. I don't care. I really don't care. If you don't feel the butterflies anymore. You know what? Grow up. I mean, the fact is that we're not going to feel the butterflies. Anybody that's ever been in a relationship knows that those butterflies don't last forever. And so you're not going to be in that honeymoon stage forever. And that's the stuff that you hear today. And the spiritualization of it. Okay, there's a guy, I think I mentioned this in a sermon before, his name is Pastor Greg Locke, and he's like this. He used to be an independent Baptist, and then he went off into this new evangelical garbage where he's swaying to a rock band. He's wearing the skinny jeans, and he got all the trendy clothes and all this stuff. He divorced his wife and is marrying the secretary, or is dating the secretary. I don't know if they're getting married yet or not. And he didn't step down. And so what he tried to do is justify it. And all these people that get divorces. Now here's the thing, if you got a divorce, and if you're remarried, or if you just got a divorce, I'm not against you, and I understand there's a lot of situations where it's inevitable and you can't control it, right? You can't chain somebody to your house, right? I don't think that's legal. But basically, I don't think so anyway. But all I'm saying is that these cases, though, where people are in a spiritual leadership. If my wife divorces me, or if I divorce my wife, take it to the bank, I will not be the pastor here. Do you know how embarrassing that would be anyway? Like, first of all, I wouldn't be qualified. If I'm not ruling my own house well, and my wife leaves me, then there's no way that I would stand up here and try to do this anyway. But there's so many people that are pastors that are being divorced and getting remarried, and they think it's fine. You know what that tells everybody? Is that, oh, I can do it too. The pastor's doing it, I can do it too. And so there's a lot of this stuff, and all I see is the children's lives being destroyed by all these people that just want to have a better life for themselves. How selfish and how just wicked that is. If you're in a relationship and you have children, and I don't care if my wife hated my guts, chewed me out every single time I came home, I would stay with her for my children's sake. And obviously, she wouldn't be doing what she's doing right, but it doesn't matter. You need to stay married for the children's sake, if anything. Because I know people that are going through this, and I see the signs of it. And what it comes down to, I think a lot of times, is that the people aren't saved, so they're not getting biblical preaching. But a lot of times these people are in these watered-down liberal churches where they're just going to tell you what you want to hear. They have itching ears. And as much as I don't want to preach this sermon because it's not popular, because people have made mistakes, I'm not going to be that itching ear, that scratching of the itching ears preacher. And so the Bible's very clear on this subject, and so we don't need to be wondering about it. People make mistakes, and I'm not against people that make mistakes, but I'm not going to justify it just to be popular. And dead sure I'm not going to justify it if I were the one that got into that situation, or I was the one that made a mistake, or something happened like that. Take it to the bank. If I were to ever get a divorce, God forbid, I will not be pastoring ever again. And if you see me doing it, take this sermon and shove it down my throat. Now, it doesn't mean that I couldn't still serve the Lord. Doesn't mean I still can't go soul winning. Doesn't mean I still can't live a godly life. But I dead sure am not going to pastor a church if I'm doing that. But the excuses that people have for a divorce, and what makes me more angry than anything is when they try to use the Bible to use that excuse. Where they try to spiritualize it. Well, I've had this spiritual awakening, and I just heard from my girlfriends over here that I'm just too good for you, honey. I'm just too good for you, and I'm too spiritual for you. You're beneath me, therefore, we're going to get a divorce. And what you find is that they're not obeying their husband. They're not giving them due benevolence. Therefore, they're completely wicked and not right with God, but somehow they're filled with the Spirit. And somehow they're godly, more godly than their husband when they're disobeying the major commandments of God when it comes to marriage. Give me a break. And this goes for the men too. The men that want to trade out their wives when they get a bunch of money, or they come into a bunch of money and they're like, you know what, I want a prettier wife. And so I'm gonna not give her due benevolence and cause her to commit adultery against me, therefore I'm going to go and find some other wife. Men that don't support their families, men that don't do what they're supposed to be doing, they just go home, sit on the couch, drink a beer, and then they wonder why their wives don't want them. And so next week we're actually going to get into a lot more details as far as like how do you have a good marriage. And here's the thing. If you do have a husband that sits on the couch, drinks a beer, and doesn't do what they're supposed to be doing, you need to stay married to them. And if you have a wife that doesn't do what they're supposed to be doing, even if they're not giving you due benevolence, not doing any of that stuff, you need to stay married to them. And so that's what the Bible's teaching. And now go to Matthew chapter 5. So Matthew chapter 5 touches on this. We already read Matthew 19, but we will go to that too. But I want to go through all the gospel places where Jesus is talking about marriage and talking about divorce, and just see what we're dealing with here. Because people basically, the pastors, and I blame the pastors, I blame the church house, I blame the weak leadership for not preaching the Bible for what it says.
Amen.
Because a lot of these people that have gotten divorces, and they realize, you know what, it was actually better with that first wife. A lot of people have said that. And they wish that they had someone that would have told them, you know what, I should have stayed with them. And so, anyway, so Matthew 5, verse 31, we get it, this is the Sermon on the Mount. And so Matthew 5, verse 31, it says, And it hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced, committeth adultery. So now we see this again, this saving for the cause of fornication. So we saw, except for the cause of fornication, we'll read that. Go to Matthew chapter 19. And so we see here that he's talking about this divorcement. And he said there's basically only one case for this, or one cause for this. Matthew 19, verse 7, he says it again. It says, They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing divorcement and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. So, in both these cases, but notice here, he says, Moses for the hardness of your hearts, but it was not from the beginning. You know what I believe about this? Is that there was no case for divorce up till the Old Testament. Up till Moses' law here. Because he's saying from the beginning it was not so. What was not so? The writing of divorcement. Okay? And so, now this is something that would have to be, and another reason why it had to be by law, because how in the world do you have this like law of divorcement if there's no law of you even being married? Okay? So that's another reason why you need to have that certificate. So in both these cases it's saying except for fornication and saving for the cause of fornication. Now go to Mark, so I want to show you these other places. Those are the only two places that give you an exception. Now it's saying the same exact thing, but it's only in Matthew. In Mark and Luke, it doesn't give you that exception. It just says straight out, if you marry another, you commit adultery. Now Mark chapter 10 and verse 2, it says, And the Pharisees came to him and asked him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife, tempting him? So notice these guys are tempting him. And he answered and said unto them, What did Moses command you? And they said, Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. And Jesus answered and said unto them, For the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. Then he goes into, at the beginning, he made a male and female. Verse 11, it says, And he saith unto them, Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. And if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery. So see, it's giving you both directions. But notice it didn't say for fornication. The reason I'm saying this is I'm not saying that negates the say for fornication. I'm saying that there's a reason why Matthew says it and the other ones don't, because I think Matthew gives us a perfect example of what that's talking about. But in Luke chapter 16, so this is the other place. Luke chapter 16 is obviously the story of the rich man, and then there's another parable in front of that. And there's just one verse where he just says this. Okay, so he just, here's what he has to say about putting away. In Luke 16 and verse 18. Luke 16 verse 18. Whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her that is put away from her husband committeth adultery. Period. Now, is there any question that that's a pretty hard line? And even his disciples said, if this be the case, it's not good to marry. So his disciples were saying this, and you may be saying that to me. Well, that's what his disciples said. So that's what he's preaching here, is that it is a hard line. It is something that's very serious. And what I want you to see here, so we're going to talk about this save for fornication, or except for the cause of fornication. Now this is where people are going to have different views and opinions. I'm going to give you what I believe this is talking about. If you don't agree with me, it's not like this is a make or break, like you can't be in the church unless you agree with me on this, okay? But I'm going to preach this and tell you what I believe it's talking about. Notice that it doesn't say save for the cause of adultery. Now, other versions of the Bible put adultery here. I believe there's a reason why it says fornication. Now, some people believe that fornication only deals with people that aren't married, like two people that aren't married that can make the act of what married people would do, coming together or lying with somebody, right? I believe fornication is actually a broader term that encompasses all sexual sins, okay? And so go to Galatians chapter 5. I'm going to give you a reason why I believe that, and I don't believe it negates what I believe either. But, there's a case in 1 Corinthians 5 where there's fornication among you, and such as should not be named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. So there's a case where fornication is used where he sleeps with his father's wife. Okay, so obviously that would be adultery. Now, the idea that could be just the fact that his father died and his wife was still, but to me, there's other scripture in that to where it says, when it's talking about in 2 Corinthians, where he's talking about reconciling with people and reconciling with that guy that they threw out. It says, talking about the one that was harmed, and it's like, who else would be harmed besides the husband? So anyway, all that to say is that could be the case because Nabal's wife, Abigail, is mentioned after Nabal dies. So I can see people saying that. But this is what I believe. I believe fornication is a broader term with all sexual sins. Adultery is only in the confines of marriage, meaning that you can only commit adultery as if one of those people is married, okay, or both. But in Galatians chapter 5, verse 19, it says, "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness," and it goes down through this list. I believe actually this list is given a progression that adultery is more of a fine-tuned, like this is just between people that are married. This is sexual sin. Fornication would be any sexual sin, and then uncleanness can include sexual sins, but it's even more broad than that because uncleanness could just be that you didn't take a bath, okay, or other things that the Bible talks about. Touching a dead body is unclean. Like there's all these different things, uncleanness. So what I believe is that adultery and fornication are all unclean. So that would all be under uncleanness. Adultery would be under fornication, but fornication is not necessarily adultery. Does that make sense? And uncleanness isn't necessarily fornication, or it isn't necessarily adultery. Does that make sense? So you have this really big, broad term where it's uncleanness, which could even just be talking about things that aren't dealing with the bedroom. Fornication is dealing with the bedroom. Because if you think about Sodom and Gomorrah was given over to fornication and went after strange flesh. So fornication is implying sexual sins that are dealing with men and women and women, okay? And so, but adultery is a sin that's dealing with married couples, okay? So two people that aren't married that come together, it is sin and it's fornication, but that's not adultery, okay? And so there's a reason why I believe it uses the word fornication, but we're going to look at because fornication is a broader term. But I believe it's using that and not adultery for a reason, because I don't believe it's something like you've been married for 5 years, they commit adultery, therefore you can get a divorce. I don't believe that. Now that's where people are going to go with that. And I don't believe that, especially when you look back at these passages in Deuteronomy. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 24. I believe that the case for where you can get a bill of divorcement is more like an annulment, okay? And we have that even today where it's an annulment. It's like at the very beginning of marriage, you find out something, okay, and then you're like, I'm done with no. And so we'll see what that's talking about. But the reason I went through that whole uncleanness stuff is because when you go back to the bill of divorcement, it uses the word uncleanness and not fornication. So Jesus is actually giving you a little more light on what that's dealing with. It's not just the fact that they didn't take a bath. Okay, and that's where if when we see this, you'll see why the Pharisees are saying, oh, can you divorce them for any cause? They're not clean. They touched a dead body. I can divorce them. And that's where they're going to go with this. Okay, but in Deuteronomy 24, this is where the bill of divorcement is. And verse 1, Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1, it says, "When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and sendeth her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after that she is defiled. For that is abomination before the Lord, and thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So there's a lot of information here, but first I want you to see is that it says, it comes to pass that she find no favor in his eyes. And this is where I think the Pharisees are underlining that and saying, see, I don't like her, so I can divorce her, okay? I don't have the butterflies anymore, therefore I can divorce her. No, it says, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, okay? So this is where I believe the fornication comes in. And where the fact that if you're getting married, and let's say, and then the only way that you're going to know there's uncleanness in her is if you're like about to come together or you're coming together, okay? This is that where you're going to consummate the marriage here. And you find some uncleanness in her. And for sake of children, I'm not going into details on this type of stuff, but obviously if you commit fornication, there are recompenses to be paid for committing fornication. There's STDs, there's all this uncleanness, there's all kinds of stuff, and stuff that you could have for the rest of your life because you commit that act of fornication. I'll preach a whole sermon against fornication probably soon, as far as just the fact that we're supposed to flee from it and not have anything to do with fornication. But obviously there's something here to where he knows that she committed fornication, or something happened to where he knows that this is not what he signed up for, so to speak. And so the fornication, I believe this is dealing with something that she did before they came together, and as they were coming together, he's finding this out. Now you could say that, well, when is this? Did they already consummate the marriage? It's possible that they did, but my take on this, and I'll show you, there's only one case in the Bible where it says that divorce was just, and they hadn't consummated it. That doesn't mean but that's the only thing I got to go on, okay? So when I say that this is my opinion, this is what I believe, I'm just going off what I see in the Bible, and that's what I'm going with. And so anytime there's a gray area, I always take the harder line. Does that make sense? And that's the way I deal with issues when there's a gray area. I'm just like, that's a gray area. It's kind of like hair length. When it comes to hair length, there's not like a measurement in the Bible as far as here's long, here's short. I just make sure that there's no doubt when someone looks at me, my hair is short, okay? You don't need to have a buzzed head, okay, to be short. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with a buzzed head, but the thing is that, and being long, you could say, well, is touching my shoulders long or whatever, I would just take a harder line to it. I mean, I'm not saying it is wrong, if you have hair that comes to the shoulders or whatever, but all I'm saying is that I usually take a harder line when it's not specifically telling me exactly what it is. So in this case, she didn't find favor in his eyes because he found some uncleanness in her. Okay, so this could very well be after consummation, but it seems to be at the very beginning. Okay, at the very beginning of the marriage. So that's why I believe this is more like an annulment in our day and age, where you get married and then you're just like, you know what, no. And obviously, I'm not saying annulments are always right either. People go to Vegas and they get married and then they get an annulment the next day. I'm not saying that's right. But all I'm saying is that in this case, it's more like an annulment. It's not like 2 years down the road, you're like, I found out that you had this relation with somebody back then. No. Okay, that's not what we're talking about here, where we're bringing up dirt from years ago and saying you can get, this is something where you're finding out at the very beginning. But notice too, now this is something interesting, because this is something that people are doing today, and they'll say, well, I got a divorce and I got remarried, now I need to divorce that husband and go back to, or divorce that wife and go back to the original. The Bible actually says explicitly against that right here, right? What did it say? It says in verse 4, it says, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after that she is defiled, for that is abomination before the Lord. So now you're supposed to be reconciled. Let's say you get a divorce, and if you can, be reconciled together. But if they marry someone else, or you marry someone else, now there's no reconciliation after that. That's actually an abomination to come back together. But it does say in this passage, so this case of divorce, it says that she may go and be another man's wife. So in this case, they can be remarried, because it was this case of finding uncleanness in her, finding this fornication. And it says in the case of or saving for the cause of fornication. So you can see that it's giving clarification. How did this person get this uncleanness? It wasn't just through natural causes. Okay, this is something that, it wasn't just because she didn't bathe. Okay, this is something to deal with, something she did in order for this to be the case. But step back to Deuteronomy 22, and I'm going to give you, this is, I believe, giving a little more light on this. So in the actual bill of divorcement, it says uncleanness in her. And then in this case, it's actually talking about that she wasn't a virgin, which would be the case in that with finding uncleanness. But this is more so the fact that she lied about that she was a virgin. Okay? So you can see, though, where this would be, where he said, for the hardness of heart you did this. Because if you really are a loving and forgiving person, you could forgive it. Does that make sense? I'm not saying that you have to, I'm not saying, but I'm just saying the hardness of your hearts is why he wrote this precept, because in honesty, you could say, you know what, no, I'll forgive you for doing that. Let's move on from here and, stay faithful, And so, but in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 13, notice it talks kind of about the same things about the wife here. In verse 13 it says, if any man take a wife and go unto her and hate her, and give occasions of speech against her, and bring up an evil name upon her, and say, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I found her not a maid. Now, not a maid, that's talking about being a virgin, meaning that she hadn't been with anybody else. So he's basically saying, I came in unto her, and I found out that she had been with someone else. That's pretty much what he's saying. Now, it goes through this whole thing. We'll read the rest of this, because in Israel, this is what they had to do to figure out if this was true or not. But it says, then shall the father of the damsel and her mother take and bring forth the tokens of the damsel's virginity unto the elders of the city in the gate. And the damsel's father shall say unto the elders, I gave my daughter unto this man to wife, and he hateth her. And lo, he hath given occasions of speech against her, saying, I found not thy daughter a maid, and yet these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city, and the elders of the city shall take that man and chastise him, and they shall immerse him in 100 shekels of silver, and give them unto the father of the damsel, because he hath brought up an evil name upon a virgin of Israel, and she shall be his wife, and he may not put her away all his days. But if this thing be true, and the tokens of virginity be found for the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones that she die, because she hath wrought folly in Israel, to play the whore in her father's house. So shalt thou put evil away from among you. So in this case, we see here that if it's true, they're actually going to put her to death. If it's not true, then he's going to pay a fine, and he can't put her away. Okay, and so these are the two things that I see in Deuteronomy when it's dealing with a divorce or putting away somebody. And to me, it seems like it's at the very beginning. I'm not saying it's before consummation, although in the one case that we have, as far as an actual situation, it is before consummation. Okay, so to me, I guess you could find out before you consummate, but it's something that I don't know. It doesn't necessarily give you a timeline like this is 5 days after or this is whatever. But the thing you got to understand about marriage is that it's a vow. Isn't that what we call when we give our vows? Okay, we're making a vow that we're going to stick with this person till death. And there's plenty of people that have made some stupid vows. Okay, like Jephthah and just other people in the Bible that put themselves between a rock and a hard place where there was no way out but to sin. And that was Jephthah. He either had to break his oath with God or not kill his daughter. Now he ended up killing his daughter, and I'm just like, that's not what I would have done, okay? But I'm not Jephthah, and that's just a weird story in itself. But that's the seriousness of keeping a vow, that he actually sacrificed his own daughter to keep his vow, okay? And so it doesn't say God approved of what he did, but that's just the seriousness of the vow. In Ecclesiastes 5, in verse 4, Ecclesiastes 5 verse 4, it says, "When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it. For he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay." Now I think about this when Jesus said, when his disciples said it is not good to marry, and he's basically saying not all men can receive this, because basically you got to take that into account when you're going to get married, that, hey, this is still death. I'm making a vow to God that I'm going to stay with this person. But the one case, okay, there is that one case of cause for fornication, or, saving for the cause of fornication. But it's interesting that those two times it says saving for a cause of fornication or except for fornication, it's in Matthew, and in Matthew chapter 1 is the only place in the Bible that I can find that gives us an example of someone that was going to get a divorce, and God said that they would have been just for doing it. Okay? And it has to deal with Mary and Joseph. And there is no doubt that they hadn't consummated. Okay? And that's why I take that hard line stance on that. I'm not saying that it couldn't necessarily apply if you consummated and then you say, hey, there was uncleanness in her, or she had committed fornication, or whatever, then that wouldn't be the case either. But Matthew 1 is where I want you to go. So Matthew 1, this is the story obviously about Joseph and Mary and the birth of Jesus. But I don't think that's a coincidence, okay, that in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19 is talking about this exception. And before you get to Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, you probably read Matthew 1. So you kind of should have that in your mind, and it kind of brings you back to it. So Matthew 1 and verse 18, it says, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise, when his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph before they came together. She was found with child of the Holy Ghost. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not willing to put her away, or make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily." So we already see that put away is talking about divorce, and he's saying that he was being a just man. This is the narrator speaking. So that's what he's saying though here is that, let's say you take out the fact that this is Jesus and this is a virgin birth, right? In any other case, he would have been just, because what is that? That shows you that she committed fornication. Now they're espoused, meaning they're husband and wife. Now back then though, they would not consummate the marriage until later sometimes. So they'd be married, technically they'd be husband and wife, but it wasn't consummated until later. And consummation just means to basically, it's like the completion of a deal, so to speak. And so everything, is completed at that point. And you say, well, it does actually happen. I was actually listening to a sermon of Pastor Roger Jimenez, and he was in the Air Force, and he brought up this case, and I never even thought of it, because I wasn't in the military, and never really thought about it. But in the military, if you're married, you get a lot more money. Okay, so sometimes people do, and he's like, I'm not saying this is right, but this is what they would do, is that they would find somebody, marry them, so that they can make more money while they're in the military, and then when they got out of the military, they divorce them. Now, in that case, I'm not saying it's right to do that, okay? But what I'm saying, in that case, that would be a case where you're husband and wife, but you hadn't consummated the marriage, so it wasn't like completed, so to speak, even if it was years that went by. And so that's a case in the modern, world today of where that would technically be the case. I'd say you're still sinning though, because now I would say that you wouldn't be an adulterer if you remarried, okay? But that would still not be right, okay? You're committing fraud, okay? Because you're cheating the system, first of all, and you're saying that you're marrying somebody knowing that you're going to divorce them, okay? Now, what I'm saying when it would be right is if they committed fornication, right? Now, if they didn't commit fornication, then you need to consummate that marriage, right? You can't get out of that just because you want out of the relationship. So that's a case where that would be applicable. But this case here, they obviously hadn't come together yet, and there's no doubt, if this wasn't the virgin birth, obviously this is a case where, the angel comes to him and says, hey, this is not the case. She didn't sleep with someone else. But the reason why I say that fornication could encompass adultery, what if she slept with somebody that was married? Wouldn't that be adultery? All I'm saying with that is that's why I believe he uses the word fornication. And why fornication doesn't necessarily mean is that it's only between that. Because if that was the case, what if she slept with someone else that was a married man? Then you would say, well, that's adultery though. Therefore, it doesn't constitute for this. So fornication would encompass that as well. As far as if she committed adultery with another man, therefore, it would still constitute as fornication. Therefore, you can divorce that person. And so, anyway, that's the one case there that I see, where it's just. Okay? And so that's my hard line. That's why I take a hard line on this issue as far as that's the case that I would say, yeah, that's okay. But there are arguments against that as far as, well, I think that if you're married and then your spouse commits adultery, then you can get a divorce and get remarried. And go to Jeremiah chapter 3. This is where they go to. And here's the thing, though. I want you to know this. If you got remarried after you were divorced, I don't believe you're in a perpetual state of adultery. Okay? I do believe that you commit adultery when you get remarried to somebody and you consummate that marriage, and that's a sin, right? It's a big sin. But it's not like, okay, you're married to someone else now, No, if you're married to someone else and you've been divorced, you need to stay with that person, and it would be wrong for you to leave them. Okay? It'd be wrong for you to leave them, love that person, and go on from there. You've committed that sin, ask for forgiveness, it's over, okay? And when people do that, it's not like I'm like looking down on them. I have an extreme amount of pity and an extreme amount of sympathy for people that do that. What I don't have a big amount of sympathy for is when people justify it and say this is an example that we should follow. And people have done that. A great guy that I have a lot of respect for, Kent Hovind, did that. And it breaks my heart that he did that, but it needs to be said that that is not right. When he got remarried and everything, I understood and I sympathized with them. And I if I was in the same situation, who knows, I probably would have done the same thing because I'm a man, I'm flesh, and you have those desires. But to come out and say, I hope every divorced person looks to me as an example, that's wrong. That's where I get angry. And that's where it infuriates me, especially if you're a spiritual leader. Okay? And so all that to say is that I'm not like mad at people that do that. I'm not against people that have done that, or whatever. But what I'm saying is that don't try to tell me it's right, though. Don't try to justify it to me. Don't try to say that that's a good example that we should follow. Okay? And especially for the kids. And if anything else, just think of the kids that are in the church right now. They need the clear as crystal example of what marriage should be and the fact that there's no way out. That's what I would tell me. There's no way out. I'm married. There's no way out for me besides death. So if she murders me, then that's fine. She can go marry someone else, but she's still got to deal with that murder sin, right? So, but all I'm saying is that that's the mentality you need to go into it. And so Jeremiah 3. So I'm going to cover a case here that people use. Jeremiah 3 and verse 8. Jeremiah 3 verse 8, it says, And I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. So in this verse is where they go to. And it's funny to me too, because people that have their doctrines that are usually wrong, they never go to the verses that they have to defend, right? This one actually is a verse that you could say, well, man, it says adultery. He gave him a bill of divorcement because of it. Now, what you have to understand, first of all, is that this is a spiritual adultery, right? They didn't literally commit adultery on God, okay? So when you're dealing with adultery, when you're dealing with like Israel and God and stuff like that, you're dealing with idolatry. Now, it likens it to adultery. So it's taking a physical aspect and to explain a spiritual aspect, right? Jesus always did this. He explained spiritual things with earthly things. That's what he did with the parables. That's what he did with other things. Now, go back to verse 1, though. So with that in mind, that this isn't like a literal like adultery that's being done here, I want to show you something first. Is that in verse 1, notice what it says. They say, if a man put away his wife and shall go from him and become another man's, shall he return unto her again? Shall not the land be greatly polluted? But thou hast played the harlot with many lovers, yet return again to me, saith the Lord. Now, he's talking about that law that we just read in Deuteronomy 24 of the bill of divorcement. And he's saying, does it not say that if someone leaves and then they marry another, they're with another, that they can't return? But he says, yet return again unto me. You know what he's saying is that's what the law says about in the physical sense of adultery, in the physical sense of divorce, that you can't come back. And he's saying, yet return unto me. He's basically saying, but I'm making an exception here when it comes to the spiritual aspect. So he's giving the physical to represent the spiritual, but he's not holding it to a T, right? So this isn't a good example to pull out, to say, yeah, if someone commits adultery on me, if my wife commits adultery, I can divorce her. It's not a good example because he's automatically at the very beginning setting a precedent that this isn't to the T as far as Deuteronomy 24. Because he's saying, hey, it does say this, but I'm saying to you, come back to me. Okay? Because doesn't he say, he wrote him a bill of divorcement, and then didn't he bring him back? This is in Jeremiah 3, and he completely decimated Jerusalem, but didn't he bring him back after 70 years? And so they returned back to him. And so he's saying, this isn't exactly like that. And so it's not a good example, I believe, to say, to prove that adultery, if you've been married for 5 years, 10 years, whatever, then, you have that out. And so that's one of the big ones we'll go to. I don't believe it pans out. But the other one is where people say, well, what if they abandon you? Okay? Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So this is the big passage where people are going to go to. They'll say, well, if someone commits adultery, well, that's not what the Bible says. It says fornication. So let's first say that. But then they'll say, well, also abandonment. If someone abandons you, then you can get remarried. Well, let's see if that's what it says. Now, this is the funny part about this, is that the abandonment, when it talks about this, is dealing with the fact that your spouse is an unbeliever. And every single, especially spiritual leader, they're like, oh, my wife is one of the best Christians I know and all this stuff. And as soon as they get a divorce, it's like, she's an unbeliever. It's like, okay, did you not know that the whole time? I mean, so anyways, that's what's funny to me about that whole aspect is as soon as they want to get a divorce, they all automatically become unsaved all of a sudden, okay? And so I'm not saying that people can't, a lot of times you got to think about the fact that, let's say you get saved, and, after you've already been married, this is a lot of the times the case, where you get saved after you've been married, you can marry unbelievers, say people can marry unbelievers, and that's not right. But sometimes you're already been married, you've been married for a long time, you get saved, and your spouse isn't saved, and that's what this is dealing with. But first, let's start in verse 10. So 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10. Notice what it says. It says, and unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. Now, this is a hard line. It's saying basically he's saying that if you're both believers, he's saying, don't put them away, and if they do, if she depart, then remain unmarried or be reconciled. Those are your two options. Now, what's funny about this is in verse 12, notice what it starts off saying, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. Now, this is where everybody's just honing in on this. This is what I need to do. It's is that the portion that you would hone in on? The first part he says, I'm speaking this, but not I, it's the Lord. This is a commandment from the Lord. Now, I do believe this is scripture, and I do believe this is something that is right to do, that can be done. So I'm not saying that Paul was wrong here, but it'd be like me giving my opinion on hair length, or giving my opinion on what you should do in this or that, right? And God wouldn't be against it, but it's not a commandment. Does that make sense? It's not a commandment. So what he's about to say here is not a commandment. It's not like you have to do this if you're in this case, but he's basically saying this is allowed. And so that's why he's saying I'm speaking this, not the Lord. So it's not a commandment. saying like this has to be done. So in verse 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and shall be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. Notice one of the big reasons why he's saying stay together is for your children. And that's what I have to say to most of these people that are thinking about getting a divorce, is think about your children. Think about your children. So in verse 15, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So notice though, this is what people say, well, they're not in bondage, therefore they can get remarried. Did it say they can get remarried? No, what you got to understand here is that what he's saying is that if you have an unbelieving partner and they leave you, you can let them leave. That's what he's saying. He's saying we're called unto peace, meaning that you don't need to badger them and try to get them to stay. And it says a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. It's not saying that you're not under the bond of marriage, meaning like that you as far as like you're let go of that, you can get remarried. If you read in the very beginning of the chapter there, in verse 3, you're not in bondage to this. So I'll say this. In verse 3 there, it says, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except to be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. What I believe that's saying is you're not under bondage, is meaning that you don't have to give them due benevolence. They leave you. You don't have to do their laundry. You don't have to give them due benevolence. You don't have to do anything for them. Okay? That's where you're not in bondage. They just come back to you and be like, hey, here I am. You got to do what the Bible says, do benevolence. We need to come together. No, not if they leave you. And so, but you're supposed to be in peace. Now, what it ends with, it says, O wife, it says, how knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Notice it's still calling them husband and wife after they depart. So basically, what this is talking about is you want to get your husband or wife saved, okay? And you need to do it in a peaceful manner, okay? So obviously, if they're pleased to dwell with you and they know you're a believer and you're trying to get them saved and all this stuff, then, then that's the case you need to be in. But if not, let them depart, so maybe in that time that you can get them saved, okay? But at the end of the chapter, it doesn't say, well, you can get remarried if they leave you. Because what I see with this is I can see Christians just making it miserable for those unbelieving spouses, and then they leave and be like, all right, got my ticket, time to get remarried. And so, but in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39, so at the end of the chapter, this is how he ends the chapter pretty much. And so that there's no doubt that he didn't change his mind from Romans chapter 7, where it says that it's till death. Notice in verse 39, it says, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord, because obviously we want to be married to believers. And so this is the case that even in 1 Corinthians 7, it never said that you could be remarried. With the believers, it's saying, don't even let them depart, okay? Don't divorce them, don't leave them. And if they leave, be unmarried or be reconciled. With the unbelievers, you're basically saying, okay, I'm not going to fight you on this, but, you're trying to win them back. You're trying to win them back. And it doesn't say to get remarried. So this whole idea of, 1 Corinthians 7 teaches that if they leave you, therefore everybody starts declaring their spouse is unsaved. Now, in a very case, this could be the case. Now, think about this. I'm not saying that if you're in an abusive relationship and your children are at risk to stay with that person, okay? Think of the case of Nabal and Abigail. Now, here's an extreme example, but think about this. you're married to a reprobate. That's a case where I would say get out, get your children away from that person, okay? And obviously they're an unbeliever, but that case is where you're dealing with the fact that there's no reconciliation. You're not going to be winning that person, but you need to get out of the relationship. So I'm not saying, if there's an abusive relationship going on, and I'm not talking about someone hitting you with a pillow, okay? I'm talking about a real abusive relationship. I'm not talking about verbal, abuse and stuff like that. I'm talking about like your kids are in danger. You're actually in danger for your life, okay? That's a case where obviously you need to get away from that kind of person. And if they're not a reprobate, you need to try to get them saved and try to reconcile. But if they're a reprobate like Abigail, I'd just be praying that God would, set his heart to stone and that he would die. Okay, that's what my prayer would be. Okay, if the person's a reprobate, let him die quickly. Let him go quick and down into hell, and then you can get remarried. And so, in the end, that is the case. I mean, if the spouse dies, then you're free to marry whom you will, only in the Lord. And so, but his disciples say this to him. Okay, so in Matthew 19, so we're coming full circle. I know this isn't a popular sermon. I know this isn't a sermon where I'm going to get a lot of love from a lot of people as far as like, man, we really stand by you on this one. But this is what I believe the Bible teaches on this, and this is something that our country is failing at. As a whole, our country is failing at marriage. And in the Christian realm, we're failing at it too. There's many Christians that have been divorced, remarried, and all this stuff. But we need to take this to heart. We need to try to turn this around. And maybe if some preachers stand up and say the truth about this, that, hey, when you're thinking about getting a divorce, think about the fact that you're not getting remarried. Or that there's going to be consequences to that. And so that's the type of stuff that we need to be preaching so that people will beware. Beware of fornication, young ones. Beware of fornication because 23,000 people died in one day because of it. So the Bible puts the death penalty on adultery, so you got to understand that that's a pretty major sin. And obviously with the case of the woman that was caught in adultery, God, Jesus said, I don't condemn you, go and sin no more. So he's not saying, go ahead and do what you've been doing. He's basically saying, you're forgiven, but don't do this again. Okay? So if you've done that, obviously there's forgiveness. And if you're still breathing, there's forgiveness. But it's just like one of those things when someone has an abortion. I'm not going to be like, oh, it's okay, God doesn't care, No. God hates that. Ask for forgiveness, get it right, forget about it. God forgets about those sins. Ask for forgiveness, forget about it, and move on. That's all. And I'm not going to judge you for it. I'm not going to come down on you. I'm not against people that do it in the fact of them trying to, go on with their life. But I am against people justifying it. So Matthew 19 and verse 10, this is what they say after this. His disciples, after he says this hard saying, it says, his disciples say unto him, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. But he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. And he goes into the eunuchs, and then at the end of verse 12 it says, he that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So in 1 Corinthians 7, we'll get into this next week probably when I get into having a good marriage and just keys on trying to have a good marriage, is the fact that just because you're unmarried, if you're a widow or if you're married, unmarried, you can serve God today. So, basically what Jesus is saying here is that, if this is something that you struggle with or you're like, I don't know if I could do that, as far as being married and stay married for the rest of your life, you don't have to, And so that's what Paul was preaching. He said Paul was unmarried, and he's one of the greatest Christians to ever live. And he's saying, there's actually a lot of advantages to being unmarried. Okay? Married people, say amen. No, I'm just kidding. The fact is what he's preaching about that is that you have a lot more time to do a lot more for the Lord. Okay? Now, obviously, I'm not saying that being married is causing me not to do... I'm doing a lot for the Lord, and there's things that I can do that I couldn't do unmarried. But what I'm saying is that there's a lot of things I could go more soul winning if I didn't have children to take care of and I didn't have, the home to take care of. I could do a lot of different things. I wouldn't be able to pastor. I wouldn't be able to lead the charge on that. But all I'm saying is that there's other things to do, and you can do just as much as someone that is married for the Lord. So don't get hung up on this fact of like, oh, I made a mistake, or I need to, obviously, we have to deal with our mistakes, we have to move on, and we have to go forth from there. And so, and I don't know everybody in here. I don't know everybody's situation. And here's the thing, I don't necessarily want to know, okay? And especially when it comes to the bedroom stuff, I definitely don't want to know. And so all I'm saying with that is that I'm not against you if you've done that, if you've been divorced or you've been remarried. I'm not against you. I'm not even against somebody that if they were divorced and then they got remarried, it's not like I'm against that person, but I'm not going to be for it. I'm not going to be for that act in itself. Okay? Does that make sense? And so that's where I stand on this issue. It's a hard line. It's a hard saying. And so even his disciples are saying, who can hear this? Who can, it's not good to be married if this is the case. And so, it's funny because back then it's almost like it's like reading a newspaper, because that's exactly what people are thinking today. Isn't that exactly? If I were to preach this in a big auditorium of people in just the world today, and I preached this, they would think I was nuts. And they would just be like, you're crazy to say this. And so Jesus said, if you're divorced and you get remarried, you commit adultery. The only case that the divorce was made for was for the fornication. It was at the very beginning, and that was the only case. It's not when you've been married for a year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and then you're just like, you know what? Or she commits adultery or something like that. According to the law, she should have been put to death, okay? And so then you wouldn't have that cause. You'd just get remarried. And so there's other cases in the Bible I didn't go into as far as like the jealousy thing, where the woman, if you thought your wife had committed adultery, it's interesting. You think Numbers is boring? Go to Numbers and read this passage. I think it's in Numbers 5. It's in one of the early chapters there. And basically, if you thought your wife committed adultery, they call it like a jealousy offering or something like that, and she drank this bitter water or something like that, and if she was guilty, her belly would swell and her thigh would rot. And if she wasn't, then nothing happened. Okay? So, interesting, because obviously 2 or 3 witnesses to put someone to death, so there's not always a case where someone would be put to death. But, back then, you had to worry women, if you ever were to do something like that, then, you got to drink that bitter water, and the truth we find out. But anyway, all that to say is that obviously we're not in that realm. We're not in the realm where someone's going to be put to death. We're not in that realm, so it's even more of a big deal, the fact that you're getting into marriage, because the state's not going to recognize like any of that stuff. And so it's a hard saying. It's definitely not popular. It is what the Bible teaches on this. And if you don't agree with me on this, it's not the end of the world. But I want you to know where I stand. And at least you'll know that, hey, he preached the Bible. He told me exactly what it says. And, let the chips fall where they may. And so that's what the Bible says about marriage and divorce. Next week, I'm going to preach a sermon on basically, just I say tips, but I'm really saying what the Bible teaches as far as like what we should be doing as men and women in a marriage and why marriages are failing. So you may ask, well, you answer the fact that marriages are failing. I'm going to give you some of the number one reason. I'm going to give you the number one reason next week why I believe marriages are failing. And then we'll go into the different aspects. And I don't believe it's finances. Okay, that's what everybody will tell you, that it's finances. And obviously that can play a role. But I'm excited to preach about that. And so, stay married. That's what I'm saying. Stay married. Don't get a divorce. Okay? Let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for today and thank you for your word. And Lord, just pray that you be with us. And Lord, if any of us have committed any types of sins like that, Lord, we just pray that you would forgive us of it. And Lord, that you'd help us to live for you. And Lord, we know you're merciful and gracious. And Lord, we just thank you for that. And Lord, just pray that you'd be with us throughout the rest of the day. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.